Hello and welcome. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from Michael Collins in Maryland. Welcome to this, the third event in 2025 of our Zoom season on cultural encounters, books that have made a difference. In this, we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, Claire Asquith will be discussing the book Death Comes for the Archbishop. Claire Asquith is an independent scholar. She graduated from St Anne's College, Oxford, with a first-class honours degree. She has worked in publishing before travelling in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and the 1990s with her husband, a distinguished diplomat, working in Moscow and Kiev. Her publications, somewhat controversial at times, include Shadow Play, The Hidden Beliefs and Coded Politics of William Shakespeare, and Shakespeare and the Resistance, The Earl of Southampton, The Essex Rebellion, and The Power That Challenged Tudor Tyranny. She's not frightened to say what she believes and is a scholar that I admire greatly. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guests to answer, and Michael Collins will join us also in the discussion. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. And with that, I hand over to Claire. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that nice introduction. There's been a little bit of mis-selling in the title of this, just to let you, the audience, know. I wanted to include negative portrayals of the clergy in fiction in the last 200 years as a contrast to this book. And I had a section on it, but I thought I would perhaps leave that to you. So while I speak, you might be thinking of questions related to that, of contrasting or maybe parallel treatments of the spiritual life, of the life of the clergy, of perceptions of the clergy. The title of this series is a very interesting one. It's about reaching out to recognizing otherness. And recognizing the other is a theme so central to this book that it could almost be its subtitle. Otherness, for those of you who know Willa Cather, is of course a central part of all her novels. In 1882, when she was 9, her family moved from Virginia to the plains of Nebraska, where European immigrants were colonizing the lands of the resettled Native Americans. She was fascinated by her new surroundings and would come back from visiting her neighbors unreasonably excited, she said, at getting inside another person's skin. You can call this natural empathy, but in a writer like Cather, it actually becomes what Keats calls negative capability, an ability to empty herself in the face of another person. She was hugely successful in her lifetime, winner of many prizes, member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, but actually Cather herself was privately other. She kept her private life secret because she lived with a female partner, Edith Lewis, for 40 years. And she ensured that many of her letters and papers and journals were destroyed. There's a lot we don't know about her. Death Comes for the Archbishop, written towards the end of her career, asks a question that she's clearly considered in great depth in the course of her life. How does religion treat otherness? Can religious conviction, even missionary religious conviction, coexist with genuine toleration? Her family were Baptist, and her own religious beliefs were one of the things she kept private. We don't know about them, but she chooses in this book, she chooses Catholicism for her test case. The plot of the book is simple. It's based on a true story of two 19th century missionaries. The young French Archbishop Jean Latour and his vicar, Joseph Vaillant, are sent to the Diocese of New Mexico, recently acquired by America, a whole new stretch of land. The pair, who are complete opposites like all great literary partnerships, met in the seminary, and their lifelong friendship is central to the narrative. Their task is to revive the Catholicism originally introduced 300 years earlier by the Spanish to the Mexican peoples, and the book covers their grueling journeys across the new territory as they struggle to reform decayed parishes and establish a new diocesan center in Santa Fe. The narrative takes the form of a series of vignettes, almost a chain of little short stories. In a sense, it's undramatic. Neither men are martyrs, neither undergoes a spiritual crisis, and when death comes for the Archbishop, it is peaceful. And the book ends with the sentence, "The next morning, the old Archbishop lay before the high altar in the church that he had built." Now, why is this one of the most moving endings of any novel? And how is it that death comes to the Archbishop, which calmly negotiates a minefield of issues that would make today's sensitivity readers fall off their chairs: colonialism, cultural identity, clericalism, the place in the Catholic Church of women, of power politics, of corruption, of sexual abuse, of homosocial friendship, of schism? How is it that this book is generally recognized as one of the finest 20th century novels? And the life of two male Catholic missionaries of all people should be generally accepted as a rare literary depiction of what a life well lived might look like. Well, let's zoom in first on the two main characters. The handsome Archbishop Jean Latour comes from an old family of scholars and professional men, a man of severe and refined tastes, but very reserved. He is gracious to everyone, but known to very few. He is cooler and more critical in temper than his companion, hard to please and a little grey in mood. His impulsive assistant, Vaillant, a baker's son, is ugly, homely, real, persistent, with the driving power of a dozen men in his poorly built body. We meet them first over a Christmas meal of hard-won ingredients in their new homeland, exquisitely cooked by Vaillant, who laments the tragic absence in Mexico so far of leeks, that king of vegetables. So these two men are quintessentially Provençal, the kind of priest perhaps Willa Cather met in French Quebec, Old French Quebec, which was one of the places she was particularly drawn to. Our introduction to them, particularly Latour, is subtle. Willa Cather's deceptively plain style, she was in fact an admirer of Henry James, is a sophisticated mix of the objective and subjective, so that we see the world imperceptibly refracted through the mindset of the protagonist, in this case, Latour on the whole. The great clouds over the Mexican plains, for instance, are as much part of the landscape as smoke is part of the censer or the foam of the wave. And you see how she guides us into experiencing life through the eyes of a man who is at once a priest and an acute observer of nature. I don't know about you, but to me, it's a rare experience to be fictionally in the mind of a genuinely admirable and convincing Christian Catholic character. Latour's first act in the book, Lost Without Water on the Plains, is to kneel at a cactus that he finds shaped oddly like a cross, to pray for perhaps half an hour, and to rise looking refreshed. He becomes dizzy from dehydration, but empowered by long training, the young priest blotted himself out of his own consciousness and meditated upon the anguish of his Lord. Before long, his prayer is answered. He stumbles on an isolated settlement in a fertile desert valley. Latour is not only devout, he is ever curious, ever imaginative, ever attentive to the world around him. The phrase, "nothing human is alien to me," is true of him. Very delicately, Cather explores his responses not just to the landscape and its people, but to the full range of issues confronting the church then, and even more today. Islam, surprisingly, comes first. Latour hears in the ancient Spanish church bell that Vaillant has found in the basement and hung in his Santa Fe church, just outside it. He hears, as he wakes up in a kind of dream, the beauty of the sound of the church bell, and then something Eastern with palm trees, Jerusalem perhaps, although he'd never been there. And Latour muses, over breakfast with Latour, that it could have had Moorish silver in it. And he recalls that the Angelus was brought back by the Templars from the Crusades, and it is really an adaptation of a Muslim custom. Father Vaillant sniffed. I noticed scholars always managed to dig out something belittling, he complained. Belittling, responds Latour? I should say the reverse. I am glad to think there is Moorish silver in your bell. The Spanish taught the Mexicans, Mexicans taught the Navajos, but it all came from the Moors. A little indication that she's going out of her way to show us a very tolerant man is an unnecessary mention of the Protestants. When the Mexican Catholics in one village start inveighing against the local Americans, Latour likely recommends the friendly Protestants in Ohio. But always in the foreground, the main group of people, the big opposite to Latour, to the two priests, are the Native Americans, which she calls Indians in the book, so I'm going to call them that when she does. Although he's a missionary who baptizes and ministers to them, Latour knows, talking to the young Navajo Jacinto, there was no way in which he could transfer his own memories of European civilization into the Indian mind. And he was quite willing to believe that behind Jacinto, there was a long tradition, a story of experience, which no language could translate to him. And when a trader mocks Indian superstitions, saying they'll never change, it's pointless trying to evangelize them, Latour replies that veneration for old customs was a quality he liked in the Indians, and that it played a similar part in his own religion. A deep friendship, rare for both of them, develops between Latour and a similarly sophisticated, withdrawn Navajo, Eusebio. Latour visits Eusebio after his son dies. The usually silent Indian holds Latour's very fine white hand in his very fine dark one. And he says just one thing, my friend has come. On a long trek with Eusebio, Latour begins to understand the Navajo. The land and all that it bore, they treated with consideration, not attempting to improve it, they never desecrated it. It was the Indians' way to pass through a country without disturbing anything, to pass and leave no trace, like a fish through the water or birds through the air. Cather was occasionally accused of romanticizing her subjects, but Latour is finely attuned to the evil as well as the beauty of the Navajo religion. He shelters from a blizzard with Jacinto in an almost inaccessible cave. It has a vent high up in the wall, which Jacinto swiftly fills with mud. The place, its smell, fills Latour with extreme distaste, and it dawns on him that this could be the home of the snake god, where the Navajo are said to sacrifice their babies. He hears a sound like a heavy roll of distant drums. It is a huge subterranean river. Jacinto shows him to where he can listen to the great flood moving with majesty and power far, far below. He too is filled with awe, like a Navajo. It is terrible, he says, after listening for a while. And whether he's referring to the mighty river or the snake god is unclear. He wakes that night and sees his guide on some invisible foothold, spread-eagled against the wall, listening at the mud-filled vent with supersensual ear, supported against the rock by the intensity of his solicitude. There's this, I must just pause there, because extraordinarily this morning I looked at Richard Rohr. I don't know if any of you know his podcast feed. Today it's delivered by an American Indian, a Choctaw Indian. And extraordinarily, he talks about grief And he relates grief to what he calls the underground river in each of us. And he says, as to the Indian peoples, water is our first medicine. And he ends his little piece, what waters can you honor and protect as sacred? The episode deeply affects him. He never again goes into a cave. It's beautifully done, I think, the way Latour absorbs the horror and the awe of these two aspects of the Navajo religion, fear of the power of nature, which leads to infanticide, and awe at its grandeur. One of the reasons he dies happy is that he lives to see the Navajo at last return to their native lands. Far more challenging to deal with than the Indian mind are the minds of Latour's fellow priests in Mexico. Each one is the subject of a brilliant sketch, and they seem chosen almost to represent the 7 deadly sins. Yet in each of them, the Christ-like Latour sees through the false to the possibility of good. And he deals with each one of them differently and with sensitivity. Some are dissipated and corrupt, like the popular poker-playing, alcohol-soaked Father Gallegos, who openly lives with his mistress. His rich Mexican family runs the parish to suit themselves. He's understandably nervous about the episcopal visit, but to his surprise, Latour expresses neither astonishment nor displeasure at anything he sees. And Latour even responds to this man's charm. There was something engaging about him as a man, he thinks. But he has no hesitation when he leaves in suspending Gallegos as a warning and replaces him with Vaillant, even though it's very unpopular. Trickier is the challenge of schism. The scandalous Father Martinez, a Rabelaisian bull-like debauched character, openly attacks his superior's ignorant reforms. He breaks with the new diocese and heads up his own colorful indigenous Mexican church with its bloody penitential rites, its local traditions, its secret dancing. Latour has a memorably awful visit in this man's revolting household, but he swallows his disgust. He accepts his manners, his arrogance, and he actually admires his beautiful celebration of the Mass. This Mexican, he thinks, rightly guided, might have been a great man. Martinez has one follower, Father Lucero, a truly appalling embodiment of priestly avarice and greed, who loathes everyone, even Martinez, and of course, Latour. On his deathbed, Latour goes to great personal sacrifice to attend this man, and it's a ghastly scene of complete unrepentance. In this case of schism, Latour argues, but in the end leaves the pair to run their own church, and the schism dies away at their death. Worse than these two is a genuinely evil priest, cruel, power-driven, a monster of greed and egotism. Latour visits the village of Acoma, built on a rocky outcrop so spectacular that it reminds him of the archetypal Rock of Peter. Yet the vast ruinous church, like the Indian cave, is an evil place. He had never found it so hard to go through the ceremony of the Mass, Cather writes. The Acomas seemed to him a type of life so old, so hardened, so shut within their shells, that the sacrifice on Calvary could hardly reach back so far. Elsewhere, Father Vaillant says he sees such souls as being like seeds, full of germination but no moisture. But Latour retires in this case with a sense of inadequacy and spiritual defeat. Later, he hears the story of the church and the man who built it, Father Balthazar of Acoma, who 200 years earlier tyrannized his flock, murdered a serving boy, and was himself flung off the rock by the people he'd enslaved. And then there's a more general question, beyond the difficulty of dealing with these priests, of superstition and miracles. One would expect the intellectual Latour to reject both, but no. There's a wonderful description of one old priest, Father Jesus, who lives in a very primitive hut, and it's filled with parrots. Latour notes that he is very superstitious and simple, almost to childishness. But he notes there was a quality of golden goodness about him. Miracles. A debate on miracles comes up early in the book, after both priests, Vaillant and Latour, hear the tale of the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, told absolutely straight in circumstantial detail. And the story moves Vaillant greatly. He resolves at once to go there. Doctrine is well enough for the wise, Jean, but the miracle is something we can hold in our hands and love. Latour considers this. Where there is great love, there are always miracles, he said at length. One might almost say that an apparition is human vision corrected by love. And later in the book, Latour treasures and often retells the story of an apparition of the Holy Family disguised as a shepherd's household who give shelter to another missionary lost in the desert. Now, this scene echoes the opening chapter, which I described, in which Latour is lost, prays, almost dies, and is rescued by dwellers in a fertile, forgotten valley. So we have here a hidden theme to the book, God's rescue of the thirsty soul from its own inner desert by the miraculous intervention of the transcendent and the sacred. And this theme becomes explicit in Willa Cather's lyrical exploration of the final instance of otherness, the attitude of the two priests to women. In one memorable episode, beautifully written, Latour is going through a period of depression and self-doubt common in literary accounts of the priesthood. A sense of failure. God is absent. He can't pray. Unable to sleep one moonlit night, he gets up to pray in the church, but it's snowing and icy cold. He's about to return to bed. Then, realizing it was the cold of the church he shrank from, and despising himself, he went out. You can see there what she owes to Henry James, this very delicate dissection of the finest tendrils of motivation in a character. And further, these two details are important. He takes with him his faithful old cloak made in the seminary, and then lined in fox fur when he was in Ohio, and then remade in Mexico with squirrel, the lighter fur. And he also takes the big iron church key. Shivering at the church door, he finds Sada, an old Mexican woman in bare feet, rags, and a thin dress, the slave of a Protestant American family. For years, she has been forbidden to visit the church or even leave the house, her face worn thin and sharp by life and sorrow. It seemed to him that he had never seen pure goodness shine out of a human countenance as it did from hers. Her teeth struck together as she tried to control her shivering. With one movement of his free hand, the bishop took the furred cloak from his shoulders and put it about her. Now this frightens her. He opens the church door with the key. They pray in the Lady Chapel. He gives her a medal of the Virgin and she hurries home. And then I missed out what happens there. Then Cather writes, never had it been permitted to him to behold such deep experience of the holy joy of religion as on that pale December night. He was able to feel, kneeling beside her, the preciousness of the things of the altar to her who was without possessions. The cross that took away indignity from suffering and made pain and poverty a means of fellowship with Christ. The beautiful concept of Mary pierced the priest's heart like a sword. This final openness to and love of the feminine, is central to the book, to its concept of Catholicism, and another reason for its cultural richness. Vaillant has a similar experience. These two chapters are almost in the middle of the book, and they're side by side. They really are central to the book. Vaillant has a special devotion to Mary, and particularly to the month of May, when, through Vaillant's eyes, this sinful and sullied world puts on white, as if to commemorate the Annunciation, and becomes, for a little, lovely enough to be, in truth, the bride of Christ. All the most important events in Vaillant's own history had occurred in this blessed month. And one of these sweetnesses follows. Vaillant is convalescing and sitting in the garden with Latour. And both men see a kind of vision of sacredness of the Virgin in an abused woman they rescued long ago on their very first adventure, rescued her from the feral American murderer, Buck Scales. Now transformed, she lives next to the church, helping the Sisters of Loretto to do their work. She comes into the garden to feed the doves and advanced in a whirlwind of gleaming wings. At one moment, the whole flock of doves caught the light in such a way that they all became invisible at once, dissolved in light, and disappeared as salt dissolves in water. The next moment they flashed around. They settled upon Magdalena's arms and shoulders, ate from her hands. Vaillant comments, "Who would think to look at her now that we took her from a place where every vileness of cruelty and lust was practiced? Not since the days of early Christianity has the church been able to do what it can now." This feminine thread lies at the center of Latour's spiritual life. When Vaillant leaves him on his final mission to the Californian gold rush, he knows he's never going to see him again, Latour returns sadly to the solitude of his room. But he finds there a sense of a presence waiting for him. It was not a solitude of atrophy, of negation, but of perpetual flowering. A life need not be cold or devoid of grace in the worldly sense, if it were filled by her who was all the graces, virgin daughter, virgin mother, girl of the people, and queen of heaven, le rêve suprême de la chair. The nursery tale could not vie with her in simplicity. The wisest theologians could not match her in profundity. Without any apparent effort, then, Cather addresses all the questions of othering which now obsess us: how to align our own convictions, tastes, characters with those of others, while remaining authentic to our own identity, our own cultures and beliefs. Her answer seems to be to love both deeply and to integrate the love of what is ours with the love of what belongs to others. This fusion takes tangible form at the end of the novel, when Latour plans his longed-for cathedral meticulously. Now an old man, and he wants not a modern red brick American church. It must be on the model of our old Romanesque churches of the Midi, the most beautiful in France. With great ingenuity and effort, he imports a French architect to build it. But there's a vivid episode when he silently, without explaining what he's doing, takes Vaillant out to a ridge above the Rio Grande, where among all the green stone, he has discovered by chance, miraculous chance, he thinks, a single hill boldly facing the declining sun of golden Yellowstone, the same color as the Pope's palace at Avignon, notes Vaillant. Out of this hybrid, an architectural expertise dating back to the 14th century, when Latour's ancestors were also church builders, and the golden stone of the New World, he creates his church. The faults of most Catholic priests are on full display in this novel, particularly are those who live on and not for their sheep. There is something disturbing in Cather's equation of the rock at Acoma with the rock of Peter. Here, Christ's missionary work handed on to Peter seems to be drastically betrayed. But then there is the equally symbolic iron key with which Latour opens the church for the enslaved woman, Sada. Here, Latour, holding the keys of the kingdom, redeems the role of Peter. But not for the first time in this book, appearances are deceptive. The key to Latour's own ecstatic entry to that kingdom is in the hands of the destitute woman he has let in, and beside whom he kneels to pray. I was prompted to revisit this book by reading Chekhov's short stories and discovering just how negative his view of the clergy and the Christian church was. But then it occurred to me how few fiction writers are really anything else. And I'd again like to ask you in a minute to suggest another depiction of a convincing religious mindset as positive as that of Willa Cather's depiction of the two heroes of her novel. The writers I was thinking of looking at, I thought, did we have any special? And one, of course, there's Trollope, but his clergy are exquisite studies of the life of the Victorian social elite. They're nothing to do with sanctity. At the other extreme, in the last 200 years, there's Graham Greene, of course, and his whiskey priest. But the whiskey priest is very like a priest that Chekhov writes about, who the donor who wants to give money to this impoverished district doesn't even recognize as a decent priest because he doesn't realize the man is starving, that he, like the whiskey priest, has become actually one of the sheep rather than a shepherd. The story is called The Nightmare. It's a very good one. Embarrassed Roman Catholic writers often like to present the clergy as comic oddballs. One of the best, perhaps, is Father Rothschild, who appears in Evelyn Waugh's novels. Sort of rather ubiquitous and sinister social climber. And then there's Father Brown, of course, and Don Camillo, who have mysterious hidden powers bestowed on their oddity by their priesthood. And then in more serious books, the portraits books, novels are usually of doomed and persecuted men. I'm thinking of Bernanos's Country Priest, The Diary of a Country Priest, written at just about the same time, actually 10 years later than Cather's book. And Robert Hugh Benson's Elizabethan martyr, Robin Audrey, again doomed. It seems that sanctity takes a different path, is a tragic path in this book. To be saintly is to go to the rack. And I don't know whether in America people would have seen Jimmy McGovern's series Priest, but there again, it's in many ways a convincing portrait of a parish priest, but he's tortured by doubts. You know, is he really a priest? Doesn't seem, he seems actually to lose his faith. Conclave, I expect you've seen. Father Lawrence looks like a wonderful example of a good priest, but of course, as the film, as the book unfolds, he's doubtful. He is thinking of leaving Rome. Possibly you feel he may leave the church. And leaving priests aside, what other novel takes us into the mind of an intelligent, humane protagonist with a religious life and inner life as rich as Latour's? It's very curious because the greatest poems in the English language are actually written by priests, the greatest religious poems. I'm thinking of Hopkins, Herbert, Donne. And we accept that poems are very often people in direct dialogue with the sublime, with God. But that voice just doesn't seem to me to be there in fiction. And I'm very optimistic that someone will put me right. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, you posed a question, and as I mean, my first thought was Graham Greene, but but you're quite right. I can't think of them. I can't think of anyone. No. But and as it happens, we got a lecture tonight at Blackfriars on Jan Manley Hopkins, of course, but he's a poet. See, so that's amazing. What about you, Mike? Have you got you got a book with a priest?
A list of flawed priests. Yeah, I thought. Yeah, I was trying to make a list of priests that I think of in American literature. There's of course Nathaniel Hawthorne's Dimmesdale, who's a pretty disappointing fellow. Really, he doesn't take responsibility for his affair with Hester Prynne. But there's an odd figure in A Farewell to Arms. The priest that everybody in the mess hall mocks and makes fun of. And yet he's the one person in the book. Well, it shouldn't, maybe not the one person in the book, but he is the one who sees clearly, what's going on in the war, and he's connected with the pastoral vision that A Farewell to Arms seems to endorse. The priest comes from Capricotta in the Abruzzi, and he encourages Frederick Henry to go there. And he says that's a place where loving God is not an obscene joke or something to that effect. And that priest is very and it's characteristic of Hemingway in that novel. These people pop up and sort of embody the vision that the war and the army and so on are in the process of destroying. So I thought of those two American priests. And the other one, there's Hawthorne's story, The Minister's Black Veil. And they're the troubled priest. But to be honest with you, it's been so long since I read that story. I don't quite remember the details well enough to speak very intelligently about it. But by and large, my memory is the tormented priest of the Graham Greene style priest that it comes to mind. My wife, coincidentally, is reading The Warden right now.
Oh, is she?
Of course, the Warden is a good man.
He's a good man.
Yeah, he is a good man.
I was trying to remember The Warden, and I'd be interested. I must go and look at, because he is morally a very good man.
Yes.
But we'd never see him at prayer, and I don't think. And at the beginning, of course, this book opens fearlessly with Latour kneeling down and praying. I can't think of any of Trollope's characters actually saying their prayers, but maybe one of them does.
Yeah. My sense is, and I'm not, it's been a long time, my sense with Trollope, it's mostly the sociology of the church, not the spirituality of the church.
Exactly. And that's completely English.
Yeah, yes. You must get your living in order to marry the woman you love. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I wonder going back to this book, there's this Padre Martinez view that the soul needs to be broken, otherwise religion is nothing but dead logic, he says.
Yes.
And it's all over that argument that they have about the celibacy of the priest.
Yes. She's so clever in this book. Martinez has so many books. I mean, first you think he's just a brute, a bull, but he turns out to be an intellectual. And his house is full not just of women's hair and stuff, but it's full of books, which block, at one point she says, the books actually block out the crucifix. It's just a tiny detail. There's a cross hanging and the books block out the cross. And I think with Martinez that his clever arguments like that for against celibacy, for instance, she's set this man, his setting argues against the authenticity of his arguments and his way of life, of course. So the self-disciplined Latour talking to this profligate priest, you know whose side you're on. Whereas you can imagine that celibacy debate, exactly those words, in another setting, and you're more torn. At least that's my reaction. I don't know what you think.
Yeah. Do you think there's a sense of loneliness in the book? They ride on his own for so long, across the plains, and is there?
Well, I think at the end, their friendship obviously is something. Friendship is such a theme in the book, isn't it? Because also the friendship with the Indian.
Yes.
But you have Latour as a man who is very self-possessed, not someone who's immensely social. And towards the end, I think it's the end, where he returns to his room and she defends him against loneliness because she says, in this solitude, it's a flowering solitude. And there's the richness of his own inner life, which she seems, at the only point where she seems to step out of the book and to say something which is not, which she's saying herself, which isn't quite him. And it makes me really think she might well have become a Catholic or been a Catholic or met priests in Quebec who validated her way of life. And so there, the solitude is a rich solitude, not lonely, because it's full of the presence, and you expect it to say the presence of God, but it's God filtered through Mary, and it's Mary that fills his inner life. So but I'm trying to think whether loneliness, because yes, those long voyages, it begins with a long and lonely trek where he's going to die. He will certainly die. There's no water at the end of his tether, and he calmly says his prayers and stands up refreshed. He seems to be so strong within himself. But did you find either of them there was a lonely element to them?
I just wondered, I think it's part of the spirituality of the book somehow.
Yeah.
As you said, he's longing for water. What's the symbol of water? And he's doing that. There's another area that you don't get it till a little bit into the book, quite a way into the book actually, where they talk about their time in the seminary.
Yes.
And there's this harking back to France, and it's almost by accident that they've come out, from France. That's just it's almost there's a feeling that somehow that everything is God's will, and these things happen, and you can even from that awful priest get these words of wisdom, really, because in their own way everybody is broken, because you've lost one thing to take out another. I thought at times it's a rather sad read.
Oh, how interesting that you found that. Yes, because Vaillant, she is very good in all her books, I think, at the loneliness, the memory of the exile, that they remember home. And it begins with the pair talking French, unusually, because they try to talk Spanish but because it's Christmas Day, they allow themselves to talk French, and their mind goes back to France. And Vaillant particularly is always saying, I would rather be contemplative. So clever of her that this essentially active man actually wants to be a contemplative. The contradictions within people are just left to sit there. But he is very well portrayed as someone who's always on to the next thing. He's the active man who almost doesn't seem to have space. He goes back in his memory, he remembers his time in the seminary and in France, and he only wants to go back at the end of his life. I don't think at the moment when he says, I'd rather be back home, it's always, shall we go on? Let's go on. How far are we going to go?
Yes.
So I think they literally not just missionaries, they're men on a mission, and of course the mission absorbs them.
But of course he's built a church, which is a French church,
Exactly. Yeah. Yes,
yeah.
and but it's out of Mexican stone.
Out of Mexican stone. Yeah,
so it's a beautiful.
It's a kind of a symbol that it's been worth it. It's happened.
It's a book that lands beautifully on its 2 feet, and I think that's one of the underlying things that makes that ending so successful.
Yeah. Father Joe Simmons, SJ. Hi, Joe. He says, thank you, Lady Asquith, for a fascinating talk. As a priest, I'm always impressed by a text that captures some of the uneven interior landscape of priests. Cather Bernanos Green. To that, I would add Alessandro Mazzoni's depiction of some of the clerics in The Betrothed. No question, just a note of appreciation.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I was
Thanks,
going
Joe.
to I was going to steal Joe's idea and mention The Betrothed myself with the good priest and the bad priest in that play, in that book, I should say. You know what I wonder about it. I'm not capable of doing it because I don't know the novel well enough, but trying to understand that novel in terms of Willa Cather's larger vision about the West and the frontier, the changes in the West, and you see that in A Lost Lady, you see that in My Antonia, where part of the project of the novel is this transformation of what the Americans euphemistically or foolishly, punitively refer to as the Virgin Land, and how that process takes place, and in some way the land is transformed. In My Antonia, perhaps for the better, but to see the novel in those terms of that of one of the themes that Willa Cather works throughout her novels.
Yes, I can't remember. I mean, it's a long time since I've read the others, but of course the sod houses that the pioneers build, initially they are living in mud practically. But what the only place where she is negative and Latour doesn't open out is almost what she calls Americans. So there's the American murderer at the beginning and the American churches. The ugliness. I think towards the end they look at how things have changed in Santa Fe and how the railway has changed everything and so on, and how the built environment has already become ugly. And so I can't remember in her other books like how she views the new world that's built by the settlers.
In the A Lost Lady, which is the book of hers that I know best, that's exactly what happens. The Lost Lady marries one of the last frontiersmen, and he's a heroic figure. And when he dies, she's sort of left alone to try to shift for herself. And what she falls in with are these shopkeepers and mean-spirited people who were trying to speculate in real estate. So instead of honoring the land, they want to chop it up and sell it and make money. And the book kind of regrets the passing of that heroic moment in America. What I mean, it's obviously romanticized, but that heroic moment in America where there was respect for the land, and these people were opening up the land in a way that was, I guess we would say now, ecologically appropriate. But once that generation dies off, in A Lost Lady anyway, like the lady who is lost, so when something is lost in the land, or something is lost in the culture as well. And as I said, I don't have the capacity to do it, but it'd be interesting to see how the death comes for the Archbishop might also echo some of those other themes that seem so central to Willa Cather's vision of America.
I do agree that there is the moment when she took the beautiful lines about the Indian moving through the land. They don't want to take anything from the land, and they move through it like birds through the air or fish through the water.
Yes.
So there's a contrast there between yeah.
But at the end as well, she says in his death that he had accomplished a historic period.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's such a difficult balance, isn't it? Because essentially you think of a missionary imposing one culture on another, but it isn't like that. She does do it very cleverly, because the terrible American Buck Scales at the beginning is a subhuman psychotic murderer, and they rescue Magdalena from him, don't they? So you kind of see the I don't know, American culture definitely is as extremely negative, but not the missionary culture. The Christian culture she sees as positive. So the naive sort of exclamation of Vaillant when he says, surely even the early church couldn't perform the things that we've done here. They are rescuing people from a subhuman life, I think, in her view. The Christian culture does that and brings them into a fully human life. But American culture, the grab everything culture, is different. I think there's a big separation between the two.
Yeah. One goes off to create their own church, the church, the American church. You know, I'll do my own church.
Yes.
Which is interesting that that's come from what her background was. You know that, and the kind of contrast between who she is and how she'd been brought up, and Roman Catholicism.
I can't think that anyone with such a deep, particularly in relation to the Virgin, which I think is what must have appealed to her in Catholicism, as being gay herself, that she saw this was perhaps the one aspect of Christianity which foregrounded the feminine, which, okay, women are priests, but the idea of the feminine is central. You know, the rosary is the central Catholic prayer. And I feel she must have, I don't know what you two feel, she must have been drawn to it deeply, to know so much about it and to speak about it, speak it in such, to use such natural Catholic language.
Yeah, yeah. It is amazing, really, that.
It is, because she was brought up Baptist, and then we don't know anything else, and all have, you know, the knowledge of inner life, you know, is quite scanty, I think.
I mean, to go back to the landscape, she says the country was still waiting to be made into a landscape. So that it's a rough country, but it is waiting to be made into a landscape. But it's not there yet, and I keep wondering whether there's this aspect between a landscape and conversion, a landscape and an understanding, and in a sense, that might be to do with her and the actual Roman Catholicism, moving from one aspect to another aspect. It's just the psychology of it that interests me as you go through of what is the belief, but the beauty of that. I mean, I just thought that phrase, the country was still waiting to be made into a landscape.
There's, of course, at the end when the church is built and he looks at the church with his architect or the other priest, I don't know, but he's so satisfied with it. One of the things that satisfies him is that he says not many people will notice this, but as you approach it, it grows out of the trees. I think, do you remember that bit?
Yes.
That it's almost like a living thing and part of the landscape, and he designed it that way. Found the sign. That sort of speaks to what you're saying, doesn't it?
Yes.
The landscape, the church has begun to create a new landscape that is, it's not just a hill of gold stone fronting the sun. It's now a sort of wonderful Romanesque church fronting the sun. But against that is the awful red brick American horrors that are being built everywhere. So it can happen, but it doesn't always happen. And a bit.
Can I go back to the cave as well? That he is saved because he's taken to this cave.
Yeah.
But he's repudiated by it as well.
Yes, isn't that a complicated bit? Because it's absolutely beautifully written. And I quoted that bit about him waking up and seeing the Indians spread-eagled against the wall with supersensual ear, you know, as someone having either experience of terror or ecstasy, you don't know. And it rescues him. And yet the lips of the mouth of the cave is like a mouth. It's literally lips. It's like two lips, so he's almost swallowed by it, and it's probably looked snake-like in itself. So I think she keeps that as complex as she can. The fact he says afterwards he will never go back, and yet the underground river is so wonderfully described.
Mm.
I think he keeps that complex being drawn to another culture and rescued by it in that case, and repelled by it. Yeah, and then you've got the blizzard, Michael, which is very well described as part of the landscape.
Yes. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's no sense of enforcing the religion on anyone throughout the book at all.
You think,
It's more of taking it in, that he's taking it in.
Yes.
You know.
And the images of rejection are very strong when he preaches to Indians at some point. They're stiff, stubborn backs, I think she describes them. They're wearing wonderful robes and sitting down in the nave of the church, and they've come to Mass because that's what they've been told to do, but they are stubborn and they reject the message. And the same with the Akuma peasants, who are impenetrable. So, but then there is Vaillant's lovely image of these people as being like seeds without moisture. And there is a moment of insight into, again, how did you know this, of the missionary state of mind, that you're not imposing something, you're giving the moisture for a seed to grow.
Yeah.
That's very sort of inside intel, if you like, to work her way into the mind of the good missionary. That you're not even planting seeds, you're irrigating seeds. So it's the opposite of...
Can't get through to them. Well, don't try like that, you know. Don't try like that.
It all answers your whole kind of... the question that Pope Francis asks about the role of the priest, you know, to what extent should a priest enter into and become part of his flock and smell of the flock. And this book seems to show the way you can do that and still be a fully human, fully sort of intelligent, humane person. You don't have to be a narrowly focused, kind of driven cult member.
Claire, I think we're going to have to wind it up there. We're coming to the end, and I mean, I found it interesting and an informative session, and beautifully delivered. So thank you so much for it. I really enjoyed that, and Mike also, thank you, and Joe, it's great to hear from you. It's always lovely when you put in a question, because we miss you here in Oxford. So thanks, Joe. Our next Cultural Encounters talk will be on Monday, the 10th of March at 3 p.m. as the clocks in the US will have gone forward, but the clocks in the UK will not have gone forward. So with the earlier time in the UK, we keep to the US time of 11, but it'll be 3 here. And we've got the Right Reverend Dominic White, who's the new prior at Blackfriars. And he's going to be talking about Lucy Beckett's book, A Postcard from the Volcano. And Lucy's a wonderful writer. She's got a fabulous book, In the Light of Christ, looking at how Christianity is expressed in a variety of authors. So looking very much forward to that. Dominic's was originally going to do this later on in the month, but he asked if he could do it on the 10th. And so it's on the 10th and the 10th of March, because we had a vacancy on that time. On Wednesday, the 19th of March at 3 p.m., we've got a free speech event on energy and where are we going to get the energy from that the world needs if all these ideas are going to put into progress. So that's on the 19th of March at 3 p.m. Again, because in the UK, again, it's 11 a.m. in the US. Can I thank our friends at Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially Vice President Global Affairs Tom Banchoff and also Mary Gordon. Thank you very much, Mary, for your administration. And at Blackfriars Hall, obviously Dominic White, but also John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. And I'd like to thank Maggie, my wife, for doing so much of the administration back here at home, and also John Angus Macaulay at Blackfriars. I'm Michael Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Professor Michael Scott, or on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Again, thank you, Claire, for a lovely talk. And thank you, Mike, for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Enjoyed it very much. Yeah.
Thank you all for being with us today. Goodbye.